Uh, I've grown up in this whole kind of Platonic dichotomy that there's spirit and there's matter, and that matter is gross and that spirit is this whole realm. And I've used the same metaphor that the whole thing is pot-bound. But to have hard science that most of us that wind up on the spirit path generally flunked out of science at the 8th grade, so we aren't to be too trusted with we go into spirituality. So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled at what you've said. I'm thrilled at the map you've given me. I think to take what you've run with and say cosmic consciousness is thinking the way the universe thinks, and it's all out there in the universe. That's wonderful. I'm just going to add a little piece of the puzzle, and I can see how it connects, but I'm not sure that, well, we'll see what other people say. I work as a minor technician, somewhere in the middle of that scale, with a very broken automobile called Christianity. And I often tell people that I never know whether I am a midwife or a hospice worker. But we're doing our bit, and it's in that sense, I want to give you a field report about centering prayer and the planting of the seeds of non-dual consciousness within a religion which has been dreadfully slow to talk and think about things in these ways. I realized that the first time I ever heard of the SAND conference, I was sitting on an airplane coming back with a couple of people who'd been to the conference. I hadn't been to one. And somebody said, well, were there any Christian speakers there? And the other said, no. He says, why? Well, he says, well, no Christians have attained a non-dual consciousness. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled because this is the kind of conversation we people of the world need to have. So essentially, as many of you know, about the 1970s, Christianity began to move in and get a piece of the action by developing methods of meditation. And in the 1970s, all of a sudden we had two methods of meditation available, meditation as would actually be understood, in the general parlance of the world with Eastern standpoints. Christian meditation and centering prayer, both developed by Christian monks of considerable seniority in their respective monasteries, offering parallel paths to let Christians actually sit down on prayer stools or mats and get into meditation. Christian meditation follows a very classic route. It's mantric meditation. It was actually taught to its founder, Father John Main, by a Pakistani Hindu. And is passed on in that way, follows just saying a mantra repeatedly. Centering prayer is a horse of a somewhat different color, and when they started out working with it, nobody was quite sure how different that color was going to be. So I want to talk about that. The name most associated with centering prayer is Father Thomas Keating, who was one of 4 monks at a Trappist monastery near Boston that developed this practice, based a little bit on the practice on a 14th century Christian mystical classic called The Cloud of Unknowing, and then put in what Thomas Keating likes to call an updated format, with a little help from their friends, some Buddhists, and the TM community, who helped do things that were untraditional in Christianity. There is no such thing as meditation that traditionally has been a part of Christian spiritual formation. There is something parallel to it, but you have to know where to look. It's available in the monasteries, mostly up until the 70s, in the monasteries only. called contemplative prayer, niched and carefully hidden in a basic practice of scriptural reading and prayer called Lectio Divina, where a monk will read sacred scripture, a paragraph or even a couple of sentences from the Bible, chew on it, reflect on it, and finally just sit in its presence in something resembling non-conceptual silence. So what Thomas Keating did was simply take that non-conceptual silence, which monks accessed alone in their cells, put it in a little practice itself that you could do sitting on cushions with a bell to start it and stop it. And they were off and running. Today, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Christians around the world are practicing meditation. And it's been a way that's given a lot of people in Christianity a safe space to come home and begin to have a second look at the tradition. But it's also changing the way Christians think, particularly in centering prayer. Now, centering prayer is a little bit backwards of most meditational methods. As I said, the other method, Christian meditation, is traditional. It's straight-up mantra meditation that practitioners of Christian meditation are asked to simply sit on their cushions and recite the word Maranatha for a half an hour. It's Aramaic, Jesus' original language for "Come, Lord." But centering prayer started out and developed, particularly under Thomas Keating, with very paradoxical instructions. There is no steady state use of the mantra. That the instruction is that you only return to your, what they call, a sacred word when you recognize that you've gotten engaged in and bound up with a thought. So the way centering prayer works is that you come into your room, you sit down on your meditation stool with the intention to be deeply open to God, divine source, reality, the cosmos, the universe, whatever word you want to use in your helpful definition of spiritual, whatever you know to be the ultimate. Be completely open to it. Deeper than thinking, deeper than emotions, deeper than reflections, deeper than even that I am witnessing presence. I am here present to this whole thing. Just let it all go. So that's the intention. The way we put teeth in this intention is that when thoughts come up and you start thinking them, which you do constantly because that's the way the mind works, you do this simple, what I like to call, deal. If you catch yourself thinking, you let the thought go. So it's a meditation that's based on the repeated letting go of thoughts when you catch yourself thinking. Now, this created considerable confusion and I would even say distress in the meditation community for about the first 20 years of centering prayer's existence, when people tried to figure out what sort of a practice is this. And many traditional meditation teachers identified it as a failed awareness practice, that people would just be trying to be aware until they noticed a thought and then they switch it to mantra meditation and say their sacred word again. And some said that it put the mind into sinking mind. In other words, there's no thoughts, but there's also nobody home. So nobody quite knew what this methodology was about until one day I'd actually been practicing the meditation method for about 10 years, and suddenly it twigged a story that had been told from one of the earliest workshops in centering prayer, when Father Thomas Keating, himself conducting this workshop, introduced some people to the practice. A nun stood up afterwards, very type A, said, "Father Thomas, I'm a total failure at this prayer. In 20 minutes of meditation, I've had 10,000 thoughts." "How lovely," said Thomas, not missing a beat. 10,000 opportunities to return to God. And that's where something twigged, that the method of centering prayer is simply, it puts the cart before the horse or the horse before the cart. It upends the usual practice rather than clearing away thoughts so we can encounter God or Source in unbroken silence. It's a repeated practice with release of the attention from an attached state onto an object of thought, to a different thought. And it was in a genius sort of way, working with the material which most human beings, particularly in the West, have immediately at hand and in inexhaustible supply, our thoughts. So, in 20 minutes for a typical Westerner, you will get a good aerobic workout of this muscle of release. And it actually is a subtle imprinting. I began to realize that in my body, and I'll get back to this because this is really important for where this whole train of conversation is going. So what we're actually doing is sitting there, and thought by thought that comes up, we recognize we're thinking, we let it go. 2 more come in, we let them go. We daydream for a while, we wake up, we let it go. But in a typical centering prayer period, you will have had 5 or 6 or 50 or 60 good efforts of actually moving the mind from this state, attention locked on a thought, to this state, to just the practice of release. Now, I want to comment on that very, very briefly theologically, and then a bit more extensively neurologically. Theologically, I finally realized that what we were doing was we were practicing a letting go motion. And this is exactly the motion that is described in one passage in the New Testament, an ancient hymn in the book of Philippians, theoretically written by Paul, which says, it begins, "You also should have in you the same mind as was seen in Christ." And then it goes on to say, "Though his state was that of God, yet he did not deem equality with God something he should cling to. Rather, he emptied himself." The word in Greek is kenosin, from which we get the word kenosis as a practice. He emptied himself, and assuming the state of a slave, was born in human likeness. It goes on and on and on and moves it back into theology and rhapsody. But all of a sudden, I went, aha! Jesus taught a method. And once you saw it everywhere. His method was let go. It was a basic non-clinging practice. And you look at it, you see it in his instructions to people. Let go of what you're hanging on to. The rich man who can't get into the kingdom of heaven because he's hanging on to his money. The Pharisees who can't see what's as plain as the nose on their face because they're hanging on to their paradigms. You know, the mind in this attached state, identifying with everything, he practices let go, let go, let go, let go. And centering prayer in a way that stumbled into it, and Thomas Keating took it much farther than it started out with the early thing, was just patterning into people neurologically, at a very small way, the capacity to make this gesture, this kenotic gesture. Very, very interesting evidence is now beginning to emerge, spearheaded right out here in California by the Heart Math Institute, that really looks at what happens neurologically as human beings respond to stimuli. You can now see chapter and verse in wonderful MRI imaging, and I didn't bring any because I knew this was going to happen with the machine going down. But you can see, and probably many of you know this far better than I, and probably some of you in the room have actually written the research on this. So with all humility to have an 8th grade mirroring back of what other people know better, that what we're now discovering is that how a human being responds to a stimuli in the now that they're occupying has an extraordinary influence on what parts of the brain are lit up and what neural pathways are activated. And essentially, if we respond to an initial stimuli with any kind of freezing, clinging, bracing, hanging on, what the Heart Math Institute calls negativity, but which translates physiologically as constriction, what happens is, boom, the message goes to the amygdala, and what you get is a printout, danger, 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 and the binary mind starts right in on it, on the case, with all sorts of flight mechanisms, primitive, defensive, highly testosterized or adrenalized, reactions from the most primitive form of the brain. And I give you as Exhibit A, election year 2012. If we learn to, during an initial moment of impact, when something comes into our world, and to respond with spaciousness, non-constriction, yielding, softening, opening, staying present, non-reactivity, all of those emotional words for the state of non-constriction. Different neurological pathway. More advanced forebrain, neocortex, prefrontal lobes, and brain and heart rhythms move into entrainment. So what we're seeing is that there is now neurological data to back up what the great mystics have known, the whole school, Jesus, the Buddhists, the non-clinging school, that says this motion of letting go, releasing, understood not as a spiritual attitude, but as a physiological capacity in the bottom. This may be a bit of the scale thing you're talking about. We try and do moral attitudes without realizing that they have to be carried in the body. And that this letting go is first and foremost a physiological gesture, a response pattern. And what centering prayer did was it began to imprint this in people. Bit by bit by bit, thought by thought by thought by thought. Release, release, release. Developing that gesture as a default response to reality. Now, this is not a panacea. People have to work to take it out into the world. But you can't take it out into the world till you have it inside you. And that's what spiritual practice has missed for 2,000 years. Oh, just be loving like Christ. Oh, just be good like Christ. Oh, just give your life. Yeah, I'm a stone. Tell me how to flap my wings and fly to the sea. Until we can actually begin to work with the hard wiring. And the great mystical teachers, by coming back to this releasing gesture, have, without ever naming it neurologically, began to put the pieces together that would sustain physiologically the non-dual operating system. So that's the first piece, the working with that kenotic bit, the letting go. It's not renouncing, it's not pushing away. A lot of people do centering prayer wrong by saying, I want to push away my thoughts. But that's the wrong gesture. What you're doing is simply letting go of the subject of your thinking. And if another one pops right back in, let go of that too. Because we're working with this gesture. and you begin to learn that the movement of the consciousness is in the releasing itself, not in what happens next after you've released. Okay? It's that is the whole moment. So the other thing about centering prayer that's very interesting as a sort of physiological foundation for non-dual awareness is this whole configuration of the attention bit. And in centering prayer, a thought is defined as anything that your attention focuses on. So it could be an intellectual thing. Now, what did she really mean by that cosmic consciousness? It could be an itch on your nose. It could be an emotion. It could be a vision. If it brings your attention to a focal point, it's a thought, and that's where you release. Now, this is very, very interesting because what it means is that over and over in the practice of centering prayer, you're working with slowly withdrawing your attention from its usual configuration, subject-object configuration, into a capacity to hold its shape as an objectless awareness. I love a little phrase from the poet Rumi, who wasn't talking about attention, but he could have been, when he talks about quivering like a drop of mercury. You know, that mercury can exist in two forms, splat out, but it can hold its own as a little bead. What if our attention can do the same? And what if we can hold our attention not only as a bridge to connect subject and object, which is the way the attention works in the dualizing mind, but as a field that has a tensile energy of connectivity, quivering like a bead of mercury, without needing an object to connect with. And this format of attention has been named in some Tibetan traditions, pure awareness, Rigpa. I'm not going to be naive enough to say that beginning students of centering prayer are experiencing that. But there is a connecting link, because as you get comfortable being able to hold your attention in that form, the possibility begins to exist, again, physiologically, that you can perceive from oneness. Now, for me, my definitions are reasonably functional and mostly metaphoric, but I like to talk rather than talking about the ego and the unitive or the true self. I like to talk about the egoic operating system, because the ego is merely the mirage of self that you get by running the egoic operating system, which is a program that perceives reality by discriminating, differentiating, subject, object, inside, outside. It's all part of the structure of the mind to allow us to organize the visual field out there so we can act in it. But a different kind of perception, perceiving from oneness, the physiological basis of non-dual awareness, allows the mind, or as the ancient tradition calls it, the mind in the heart, to perceive with holographic resonance. In other words, you can find your way in the picture because you already can respond, sort of like a bat flying sonar. You find your way in the whole picture, without the need to divide the field into inside, outside, and to postulate a me with unique characters and identity to keep track of it. Your selfhood has shifted from wave to particle, or from particle to wave, and you flow. And you don't need a localized personhood to evolve. It's perceiving from within that bead of mercury of the whole. So my sense is, and I've talked with folks, there's so many maps of the levels of consciousness. Ken Wilber's are famous, spiral dynamics are famous, but they tend to make what I think is a misassumption, that what you call the whole second-tier consciousness, the unitive, the nondual, the cosmic, all those are simply teaching the mind new tricks. The shift into that second tier is contingent on the mind being in the heart, and mind and heart working together to run the non-dual program, which can perceive from oneness. The old Cartesian mind can't perceive from oneness because its operating system depends on differentiation. You ask a person using the usual mind to say, oh, show me your unique being. And they will immediately hear, oh, unique means what makes me different from everybody else. And so you'll start talking about, well, my Enneagram type, my life experience, my character is, Whereas unique really means one, monos, unikos. It means the one who's united the being. But when we perceive from differentiation, we can't hear oneness, we can't do oneness.